today. As Jim had mentioned, I do make maps, and I've been with the City of Branson as the Geographic Information Systems Coordinator for 21 years this year. And so not only do I like to make maps, but I also like local history a bunch. So any of you that know me know that Ozarks history is what keeps me going for sure. Well, how does that tie with maps? Well, I guess it started when I was about 12 years old. I got a book by Jerry Madsen called Those Who Walked with Right. And inside, in the center of that book, was this map of Fall Creek Valley. It was a hand-drawn map, and it had all these locations where all the characters that were prototypes for Harold Bell Wright's books, you know, the old mill and some of their houses, and Truman Powell's Echo Glade, which was, Truman Powell was the shepherd of the hills. And so at 12 years old, now my grandparents, they had a house on Powerline Cove, which is right on the west side of Compton Ridge, west of town here. And so on the east side of Compton Ridge was Mutton Hollow or Fall Creek Valley. So when I was about 12 years old, I grabbed a backpack and threw some snacks in there, and I thought, well, I'm going to go find these places. And now that I've admitted that in front of this big group, I hope that it's past time I can get accused of trespassing. I was just a kid. But I did find a lot of those locations, and that started, that old map and those old historic locations with Shepherd the Hills just continues to today, throughout today. But I feel really blessed to be working at City of Branson because this is my home, and it's a technology. When I first got started 20 years ago, people asked, what do you do for a living? And I said, GIS, and it took me 20 minutes to explain what that was. Now all I got to do is say it's Google Maps on steroids. So it's really easy. The technology has caught up with the rest of the world. And I got my degree at MSU, Missouri State University. At that time, my degree was in cartographic sciences, and my school was called Southwest Missouri State University. So they've changed the name of my degree, and they've changed the name of my school. So fortunately, I got a job. I'll never find one again because my degree is completely defunct. But I was in school, and my dad's here in the audience. I appreciate his support over the years because I spent enough time in school to have a doctorate. But I started out as a fine arts student, and by about my junior year, I was like, what am I going to do? And I went, and there's something to be said about guidance counselors, because she said, well, what do you like to do? And I said, well, I like to read old books about Ozarks history, and then I like to get maps and go find these places out in the woods or whatever. And she says, did you know we have a cartography department? And I said, no, I don't, and the rest is history. And I've been at Branson ever since. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about how I use that technology, that Geographic Information Systems, to illustrate history and to tell the story through maps. I'm like most Ozarkers, my sense of place is very important. It's just kind of a trait of the old Ozarkers. Their sense of location, the place, their pride in their home, and that just kind of carries on. And so everything is geographically related. So the first thing I want to talk about is one of the first projects that I did involving history and GIS. So I'm going to go to an application here called Prezi. And the first application, we all know what PowerPoint is, the slides that you see. And I ran across Prezi a few years ago, and I thought, man, this is so neat. And I've got a teenage daughter. I said, I'm so excited. I'm making a Prezi presentation. She goes, Dad, you know, you're so junior high. Nobody does Prezi anymore. But the cool thing about Prezi is it's animated and it works really well with GIS layers. But so I'm going to go through this. I tend to talk too much, and I got a lot of ground to cover. But the deal was so my heroes are the historians of Taney County, like Elmo Ingenthron, Doug Mankey. Some of you may remember those folks. And Taney County had, interestingly enough, had 2 courthouses in the beginning when the county was formed in 1837. And back in the fall of 2012, White River Valley Historical Society, the organization that has created this museum, and we're so thankful for, they contacted me at the City of Branson saying, hey, we're looking for the 1837 location of the Taney County Courthouse. And I thought, well, this would be a good opportunity to put GIS to work. So, and I apologize for those of you in the back. I hope you can see some of this. But, so that was the location of the White River Valley Historical Society Museum. And then we zoom over here to City Hall. And so I'm just going to kind of walk through this. This tells a story. So, kind of the mission at City of Branson is we always want to help our citizens and our visitors. We've got a lot of them, about 8 million every year. But we also want to help other organizations, other county government agencies, and even the museum. So we were excited to take on this task. And the White River Valley Historical Society has been around almost 60 years now, I think 1961. And their mission was to preserve history in the White River Valley, and eventually it became focused on Taney County specific. Like I mentioned previously, some of my heroes, Doug Mankey and Elmo Ingenthron, had written about that original courthouse, but they couldn't find it, so that made it even more of a challenge for me. I was like, I'm really dedicated to finding this thing now. Oh, we're going to go past that long-haired hippie. And so I put a little Indiana Jones theme to this because I'm not a trained archaeologist, but I wanted to pretend that I was for the specific task. So what are the documented facts about this first Taney County courthouse? Well, there's not much, but there are a few clues. So Taney County was originally part of Greene County, and in 1837 it was divided off, and it also included parts of Stone and Christian County as we know today. And during the legislative planning stages, there was conflict of where they were going to have the county seat. So some folks wanted it at the mouth of Bull Creek. Those of you might know it as Rockaway Beach these days. And another group wanted it to be at the mouth of Swan Creek, which is where, here's the mouth of Bull Creek, you can see here, Rockaway Beach area. And the other one was at the mouth of Swan Creek, which is where Forsyth is now, or Old Forsyth, Shadow Rock Park, also known as the Kayak Park, where you can play basketball because it's always flooded. But anyway, Swan Creek was a thriving community. It was actually one of the first communities in the county, and it had a mill and a trading post. But the center of the population was at the mouth of Bull Creek, very similar to today. So the proponents of the Bull Creek location built a little log courthouse constructed by some land donated by Joseph Price. Now this is all information that we know about from Elmo and other historians. Here you can see an old GLO map that is superimposed on the aerial photo here. So at the same time, the citizens over at Swan simultaneously constructed their own log courthouse and a jail. And they operated like this for about a decade. So we had 2 courthouses. So several sources refer to these dual county seats, but eventually in 1847 the folks over at Forsyth won out, and the courthouse was moved permanently to that location. What you see here is the old stone courthouse. It's the one that they moved right before they flooded Bull Shoals. It's actually the third of 4 courthouses. One of them was destroyed in the Civil War. One of them was burned down mysteriously during the Baldnobber era. And interestingly enough, even today, this is a contemporary map of the commission districts and the east and west. So you can see it once again, the population center is over towards the west, and we have this huge eastern district. it kind of carries over from that old, the old original two dual courthouses. So the last mention of that little log building at the mouth of Bull Creek was during the Civil War. Both Confederate and Union soldiers used the heavily traveled road which went right in front of that little log house. So another thing that happened was Power Site Dam, which was built, actually Ozark Beach Dam, I stand corrected. It was built in 1912, and it inundated a lot of the land that we're talking about. And also the utility company at that time purchased the majority of that land that we were discussing as well. So here's Power Site Dam. And here's the mouth of Bull Creek. This is a 1907 map superimposed. So what kind of GIS documents and data are available to study this? Well, there's lots. We've got the GLO maps. When Thomas Jefferson, they purchased Louisiana Purchase, and he sent out a bunch of surveyors to survey the land in this area, and they came up with a township range and section system that we still use today. We also have 1894 landowners information from the Homestead Act, which is also a hot topic during the Baldwin-Albert era for another discussion. Historical USGS maps, and historical aerial photos and current aerial photos. So I won't bore you with all the technical stuff behind GIS, but I'll tell you a little bit about it. GIS works as a layer cake, and each one of those layers are different map features that sit right on top of each other so that you can analyze a bunch of different things. If you're in a city, I've got an address, what utilities are there, what zoning is there, all kinds of different things. But so the process is prepare the data, we construct a base map, define the projection and coordinate system, make sure all the data lines up. We geo-reference those historic maps I talked about earlier, and then we analyze the results. And Indianapolis Jones says something interesting here, I think we found it. So in all those historic maps and all that historic data, there's one structure that continuously shows up. Right here on the 1907 map, the 1956 map, and even back in the GLOs, as well as the old ownership map, we see Joseph Price's name there. He's the guy who donated the land for the original cabin. So we got a potential site map we've created, and we're going to grab our GPS and head to Rockaway Beach. And this is what we found. So we entered those coordinates based on that recurring structure, and we found a stone foundation with similar dimensions described in those historic accounts. So we're pretty sure we have it, but we weren't experts, we're just GIS guys. So we called some old colleagues up at MSU in the archaeologist department. They came down there and they volunteered to study, authenticate, and they registered the site with the DNR. And now we have found the Taney County Courthouse thanks to GIS. So that was our first project, first success, and it was a lot of fun. So I'll move on here, and if you have questions afterwards, because I know I'm moving through this kind of quick, I'll be sure to answer any and all that you have as best of my ability at the end. The next project was actually, let me go here, make sure you can see the slideshow. Okay, so about 4 years ago, a friend of mine, also the director, I'm going to screw up his title, but he's a big man in charge at MSU Libraries, Tom Peters. So he's actually here today. Thanks for being here. He had a committee getting together to prepare for the Schoolcraft, Henry Rose Schoolcraft's journey into the Ozarks. And we're talking about, well, what can we do to celebrate this extremely historic event, especially for those of us in the Ozarks? And really the only thing I do, obviously I'm not a very good public speaker, and I can't sing and dance, but I can map. So I thought, well, I'll make a map of Schoolcraft's route, and we'll make that available to the public through the internet, and they can travel the route themselves if they want to. And so, who was Henry Rowe Schoolcraft? Well, in a nutshell, and to save some time, he was from out east, and this was back around 1811, 1812 or so. He came over to Potosi, Missouri, and at that time, Potosi, they'd been mining lead. The French and Spanish and Native Americans, there was a lead deposit up at Potosi, which is just southwest of St. Louis. And Schoolcraft was a young guy. He was about 25 years old at the time. And he grew up in a fairly wealthy family. They had a factory out east, but he wanted to secure a job with the federal government as a geologist. And he's a pretty intelligent guy, and he went on to do a lot of great things. He even studied Native Americans and everything else in addition to geology. But he came to the Ozarks looking for lead and other minerals. And this was at 1812, so at that time there was very little, if European settlement in the Ozarks. But he had heard about this lead deposit on a Pearson Creek on the James River, which is an area that we know as Springfield, Missouri. So over from November of November 1817 to November 1818 to February 1819, Schoolcraft and a friend of his traveled 900 miles in just that short amount of time into the Ozarks. And they spent a lot of their time lost and starving. They decided that that neither one of them had any experience with this type of travel. There was very little, if any, kind of means of transportation as far as roads. There's a lot of Native American trails, Osage Trails. And a lot of folks say, well, why in the heck did they go in the middle of winter? And well, the Osage were in control of the Ozarks at that time. They didn't live in the Ozarks. They actually lived up south of Kansas City area now, up in that area. That's where the Osage River gets its name. But they would go on hunting excursions into the Ozarks, and they were a tribe of. You didn't want to mess with this tribe. So Henry Schoolcraft, he did see their encampments and signs of their encampments, but if he would have run into them, we probably wouldn't have Schoolcraft's journals like we have today. But why is he important? Well, he has the first published account of the Ozarks. He wrote down, he was a great journal, he kept a great journal of the wildlife, the various land formations, the different geology, the different vegetation, and it gives a really good picture for historians to this day to know what the Ozarks used to be like. Well, anyway, so the bicentennial of his journey was just this past season. And I mentioned this, this slide here is Dr. Milton Rafferty. And so he was my Ozark Studies professor back at MSU. I had a lot of respect for this guy. He passed away a couple years ago, but he wrote 7 books about the Ozarks. And he spent 20 years of his life retracing Schoolcraft's route through the Ozarks. He had an old station wagon back in the 60s and 70s, and he'd get a big stack of paper USGS maps, and he laid the groundwork to find Schoolcraft's route. What he didn't have, this here is a map produced by the Geographic Resources Center at the University of Missouri based on Rafferty's maps. But what Rafferty didn't have was GIS. So we've got a lot of technology now to help improve his initial studies. And he was dealing with, you only have one scale with the USGS map. In the digital world, you can zoom in, zoom out. You can bring in satellite imagery. You can bring in topographic maps, historic maps, and so forth. So my idea was not to replace Rafferty's work, but try to improve it with technology. And I hope that as his student that he would be proud of what I did. But what you see here is the software used to do that, work with that. It's called ArcMap. And You can load in a number of different layers and manipulate GIS data sets with it. Some of the tools, like I said, the GIS, and then went out in the field, we had mobile GPS devices, and now we've got smartphones that can do a lot of the things that cost tens of thousands of dollars to do just maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But basically went in using that information on the maps, fine-tuned Schoolcraft's route that Rafferty had developed based on, and also gave me a chance to read through Schoolcraft's journals and look for landmarks that would help dial in this map information, such as cave locations and various other terrain features that would help me identify his route. Brought in some old maps, scanned some the GLO maps again for the whole state. So instead of just working on Taney County, we had to prepare this data for a good portion of Missouri. And also associated, now in a GIS, it's not just a map. It's not just features on a map. Those features are associated with a database. And each one of those map features has a record in the database that can be used to analyze, and you can associate information with it. So for each one of those points, it gave me a chance to retrace the route myself, and got to haul the wife and kids with me on some of these excursions, and we take modern day pictures of the location, associate those pictures, and also journal entries with those points. And so after this data was compiled, we can do individual studies. This is one I did for Ozarks Watch magazine, which is a great publication that comes out of the Ozark Studies program at MSU. Plug in MSU again. But this occurrence on Schoolcraft's journey just occurred just down the hill from our house in Bull Creek Valley. And Bull Creek Valley, even today, is kind of a labyrinth or a maze of these ravines and valleys. And Mark Twain Forest owns this portion of it now. But Schoolcraft, even back then, the Native Americans avoided Bull Creek Valley because of this. You would get lost in it. It was often covered with fog and heavy vegetation. And Schoolcraft found himself lost in there for a day. So I actually did a study on that. Okay, so how do we get this information out to the public? We talked about making something for Schoolcraft's bicentennial that would be useful. So we created a website that people could interact with and trace the route, just like you would on Google Earth if you're going to go visit Rome or other places around the world without leaving your desktop. But also, you can take this into the field on your smartphone, and we utilize the onboard GPS in your phone, and you could navigate with this and follow Schoolcraft's route. Now here's a disclaimer again. Remember when I told you I was 12 and went exploring Fall Creek Valley? Well, don't trespass. There's a lot of this. You can travel a lot of Schoolcraft's routes by the road for sure. So another success with GIS. The gentleman you see here on the left in the Schoolcraft attire, his name is Rick Mansfield. He's in his 70s, and he took it upon himself last year to retrace the route, camp out, and he did the whole thing. And in fact, I was honored to walk the last mile with him back to Potosi. And he utilized that handheld application to help guide his way, so I felt pretty honored about that. And it led to I actually got a piece of paper from the House of Representatives marking February 4th, 2019 as Schoolcraft Day or something like that, and got listed on there with some of my other heroes like Brooks Blevins and other contemporary historians. So GIS accomplished what it was set out to do on this as well. So, all right, this is just kind of a check. Is everybody awake? Okay, good. Okay, so now we're going to talk about another project, and this one I call the Dark Hollow Project, and I'm working on some other things that are kind of peripherally associated with this with my buddy back in the back, Josh Heston. He's the editor and chieftain of State of the Ozarks. And So there's a lot of great stories with this, but let me give you the background a little bit. So I was asked to give a presentation to the Saddlebrook community. It's north of town, between here and Ozark, just south of Busick. And interesting enough, the Saddlebrook area has an area that I call, and there's about 4 square miles that I call the Ozarks Bermuda Triangle, because in about 10 or 15 years in that 4 square miles, there was so much tragedy that occurred. It's just unbelievable. And I was able to map those tragedies and kind of give a geographic layout and pattern of where these things occurred. And people say, well, why in the world would you want to talk about these weird, bizarre, tragic, horrific events and, with history? And my argument is history is very important to me, and I feel that history is extremely important. And I was kind of a weird kid because I liked history at a very young age, when most kids like Dukes of Hazzard and Star Wars. And but a lot of kids, that next generation, they're the ones that will carry that torch. And I'm not talking about little kids, because older, young adults that are starting to find interest and study things. But like in media, it's the sensational things that gets people interested. It's the sensational things that make people want to look and learn more about what's happening. I went to give a presentation on the bald knobbers to a summer school class this year, and the kids were pretty quiet at first, and I said I wanted them to interact with me. I said, well, how many do you all have history class? And they'll raise their hand. Yes, we do. I said, well, how many of y'all like history? And about 3 of them raised their hand. I said, well, why don't the rest of you like history? And they said, well, it's all dates and names and memorization. And I said, well, you need to look into the stories. It's the stories behind it, because it's very interesting. The human experience and what we learn from history should not be covered up or removed, no matter how good, bad, or ugly. But so the Dark Hollow Project is talking about the historical tragedies of the Middle Bull Creek area, which just happens to be the Saddlebrook folks' next door neighbors. So, but they truly enjoyed it. And I'll go through this fairly quickly. I'm running low on time. But the first one was the Payton Matthews feud. And again, one of those stereotypical Ozarks traditions are the family feuds. But the Payton and Matthews they're 2 families, and they were feuding. And so the 2 parties were involved was James Patton and his kids, and Lemuel or Bud Matthews and his family. And the Paytons had 2 adult boys that came with them to the Bull Creek area in the 1870s from Arkansas. And they did buy some acreage, but back in those days, free-range cattle, free-range hogs was kind of the way of the land. And somewhere around that, the Meadows, Bud Meadows, and the Paytons got in a dispute about their land and where that boundary was, and livestock coming across, and whose livestock was what, and so forth. But to jump ahead, in March of 1885, somebody threw a stick of explosive powder or dynamite on top of the Payton cabin and literally just about blew it up. Alexander Payton was crippled for life, and his wife was deaf, and a little Johnny Payton, age 3, was severely injured. And obviously the Paytons believed that Bud Matthews was the one who did this. So Bud Matthews started getting a little scared, and he's like, well, I'm going to leave. I'm getting out of this area. So he packed up his family in a wagon, and he started traveling down Bright Hollow, which we'll talk about in a minute, heading towards Chadwick. And Chadwick was now a thriving railroad community. And as Bud Matthews was moving his family wagon down the valley, he was ambushed. They were ambushed, and they tried to shoot him. And unfortunately, they did not kill Bud, but they hit his 2-year-old son, Claudie. And so that was a sad, tragic event. The Payton boys were caught, and they were taken to jail, and one of them was sentenced to hang. And I apologize, I'm kind of abbreviating through this. I encourage you to to study it. But the governor decided to reduce his sentence because just a few days before, just 6 days before that, the Christian County Bald Knobbers had committed the Great Eden's Green Massacre. And so they were kind of tied up with that situation. 25 Bald Knobbers went to prison, and 3 of them hung on the square in Ozarks. But interestingly enough, the Paytons left Bull Creek Valley too, and they sold their farm to Steve Ballou, which we'll talk about in just a moment. I'm going to go on here. The America Pruitt incident. So this just happened across the ridge from the Payton Meadows feud, and this is another tragic story. But the Pruitt family lived at the mouth of Gravelly Hollow, which dumps into Bull Creek Valley. And William Pruitt and his wife America, they had some kids. They had 4 boys that were 14 and 28 years old, and a couple little girls that lived with them, Margaret Louisa, who was 13, and Mary Ellen, age 11. And long story short, William and one of his sons went to go do a barn raising over the ridge over towards where the Payton family was. There's a new family there now, and they were building a house, or I'm sorry, a barn. They're doing a barn raising, and somebody had come back and said, hey, my sisters have been killed. And what had happened, when they last saw them, the 2 little girls were sitting out by the chimney, by the cabin, and they were cracking walnuts with a riveting hammer, which is the type of hammer used for constructing boxes. And they had been killed with that particular hammer. And so they went and got the father. He came back, and they went looking for the mother. And she was found down in Bull Creek, where Gravelly Hollow dumps into it, with a straight razor, and her neck was cut. So there's still lots of mystery behind it, but these are newspaper articles of the day. And the coroner that came in decided that she had gone crazy and committed the act, and somehow had killed herself. So that was, I'm sorry for the tragedy stories, but this shows you an example of where those things happen. You can see this clustering of events. This is why I call this the Bermuda Triangle of the Ozarks. The next one, and this has a direct tie to indirect tie to the Bald Knobbers. This is John Wesley and Matilda Bright lived in Bright Hollow, which was just over the ridge from Gravelly Hollow, and just south of the Payton Matthews feud. And John Wesley and Matilda had a couple of kids, and they had a small farm. And for some reason, John Wesley Bright got in his head that Matilda was being a little too friendly with one of the neighbors down the hollow. One thing to keep in mind, Matilda was a Gideon, and there's a lot that's a great big, it's one of the pioneer families around here. So she was well connected, but one day John had kind of lost it, and he went up to, Matilda had gone to the spring, which was just across the creek from the house, and John obviously got upset and had shot her, and went back to the cabin. The kid said, hey, we heard some gunfire, what's going on? He said, well, don't go up there. There's some stranger was up there shooting, just don't go to the spring. So, and then he went to the cabin, grabbed his gun, grabbed his clothes, and ran off. And his young kids were just standing there going, what's going on? You know, Dad's just left. And so they were afraid to go to the spring because there was a stranger there with the gun. So eventually, after several hours, they decided to go up there, and tragically, they found their mother. And again, Matilda was well connected, and very shortly thereafter, a posse ensued, and they found John Wesley Bright. And to speed up a little bit, they took Bright to Forsyth, to the courthouse, and a mob assembled. And most of the members of that mob were ex-Bald Knobbers that had been disbanded, quote unquote, for several years by that time. So after the indictment, they found out that the majority of those were Bald Knobbers, and the majority of them were also related to Matilda. But they broke John Wesley out of jail, and they cut the rope from the well, the city well there in Forsyth, took him over to the cemetery and hung him. And so that is rumored to be the last act of the Bald Knobbers.